All right, so we got Chad Boyce here as a warmwater biologist with the Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries. We're actually sitting on Back Bay right now. So basically what we're trying to ascertain is what happened to the bay. So Chad, I'd like your insight on to first what went wrong, and then we'll go into what we can do to fix it, or what we need to do to fix it.
All right. Well, as we've talked about many times, there is no easy answer. I think everybody that's concerned about the bay would all agree that there were multiple things happening at the same time. One of the important things to keep in mind throughout the entire discussion here is that Back Bay exploded in terms of fishing attention and pressure and popularity back when a time was when bass fishing was exploding in general. So the 70s and the early 80s were a huge time for people to bass fish. And of course, as we know, at that time, catch and release policies were very liberal, and it was generally keep it and eat it type of mentality. So the big thing to remember is that bass fishing everywhere was exploding the same time it was in Back Bay. We're talking about the mid 60s to the late 70s or into 1980. A couple of key things were happening at that period of time. Number one, fishing pressure was increasing. People were catching and keeping a lot of fish. That's the bottom line. And back then there was no release citation, so the only citation was a weight citation. So fish were being kept to be weighed for citation data. The other big thing that was happening was there was a rapid urbanization of this entire watershed. Not just the Sandbridge and the east side of the bay, but the western side. There was a lot of stuff going on. Unfortunately, there were poor farming practices at the time, a lot of runoff, a lot of sedimentation. And the other thing, which is definitely the pink elephant in the room, is there was some saltwater pumping going on in the bay. There was artificial introduction of seawater into Back Bay with good intentions, but with poor results. What was going on is there was an attempt to try to revitalize the bay to mimic some of the natural processes that were going on before, and that was ocean overwash over the dunes. And there was a perception that after ocean overwash events, primarily hurricanes and storms, that there would be a resurgence in the bay's SAV, and that's not really necessarily proven. The data doesn't necessarily show that on a bay-wide basis. Localized, there could have been some clearing up of the water as a result of salt water entering the bay. But nonetheless, salt water was being pumped into the bay to the point to where it was inhibiting largemouth bass reproduction. The idea was really focused on SAV, on grass. But kind of what was going on in the background was the juvenile bass production was being eliminated. When water reaches over 1 part per thousand, essentially bass eggs can't survive. It's very difficult for bass to have successful reproduction when some areas of the bay were 6, 7, 8, 9, even 10 parts per thousand salinity. So at the same time you had a lot of fish being removed as a result of fishing pressure, you had natural reproduction very limited because of the high salinities. And at the same time you had a lot of inputs into the bay, sedimentation, nutrients. Water quality was on the decrease. Into the 70s and the early 80s, that's when the bay started to really go downhill. And one of the things that disappeared was the grass. A little side note to remember, that grass was an exotic species. That grass was Eurasian water milfoil. It was first documented in the bay in the late 60s. It exploded, as most exotic species do, and covered almost 90% of the bay. And then it began to die back for a lot of reasons. To be honest, we don't really know why. But it was going away. So we had grass dying back. The fish that were left in the bay were then being concentrated in the smaller and smaller pockets of habitat, which made fishing a little bit better. Fishermen were able to capitalize on where the fish were going to be. So there was a lot of things going on. I don't think there's a single finger that can be pointed at one user group. I think everybody needs to accept a little bit of responsibility. There's a lot of environmental variables to deal with in the bay. Being this close to the ocean, you have oceanic weather, very windy for the most part. And once we got to 1980, everybody knows it was kind of the collapse. The mid 80s, lots of newspaper articles called the bay a big mud hole, literally. And it's because that sediment that was being trapped by all the grass was now on the bottom. Every wind event would resuspend all that sediment, and we got caught in this big catch-22. So I guess that brings us up to the 80s, early 80s, mid 1980s, and the bottom line is it was bad conditions. Fishing was really poor. The grass was pretty much non-existent. There are numerous newspaper articles reported Back Bay as being, quote, a big mud hole. And the reason for that is because the grass didn't exist because the water was very turbid. And the water was very turbid because there was no grass to kind of trap and capture sediment. We call it the catch-22. You can't have one and not have the other. So where we ended up was from the 80s all the way through the 90s into the early 2000s. We had very poor water quality conditions, high turbidity, and very little SAV. Fishing pressure was concentrated in the western shore tributaries, and that's about it. When I first started in the early 2000s, it was tough to find a bass, even with the electric fishing gear in the main stem of the bay. The creeks always kind of served as a little bit of a refuge for the remaining fish populations.
Okay, so what do you think is going to be the fix?
So I guess that gets to the big question is, how do we fix what's broken? And the answer is pretty simple, and it's SAV. It's submerged aquatic vegetation. That fixes a lot of our problems. As we have higher densities of SAV, not just on the fringe areas around the shorelines and the marshes, but SAV that establishes in some of the deeper water areas, that does a lot of different things. It creates excellent habitat for freshwater game fish. It creates nursery area for juvenile fish. It provides excellent cover for the predatory fish such as bass. And the other thing, which is kind of overlooked, is it slows the water rate in which it leaves and enters the bay. It serves as like a big giant sponge. And so now we deal with these high swings, these fluctuations of water level. North wind, it'll drop 1.5 or 2 feet. South wind, it'll come up 1.5 or 2 feet. From what I understand, I wasn't alive in the 50s and 60s, but from what I understand, the bay didn't fluctuate. The water level didn't fluctuate like it does now. So that limits the water exchange that occurs. It would actually probably reduce salinity. Salinity is a big deal. Salinity is not necessary for the restoration of Back Bay. And I want to repeat that because there's a lot of people talking about this. Salinity is not the answer in fixing the problems in Back Bay. It is not the answer. The answer is SAV. Salinity limits what happens in Back Bay. In some areas, it may help influence SAV, but the idea that salt water is going to somehow cause the water to become clearer, cause sediment to fall out of the water column, and make things better, that's simply not true. The historical data does not prove it. It does not show it. Ocean overwash events show very limited effects of saltwater overwash in the bay, and pumping is certainly not the answer. If it is the answer, you may have some grass, but you will not have any bass to fish on. That's for sure. So the answer, in my opinion, is creating habitat where SAV can grow. The early 2000s, 2003, 2004 is when we really noticed things starting to improve. And there was something going on in that time period, and for those that were fishing and around and during then, you'll remember that was a pretty prolonged, significant period of drought. And when we had less input into the bay, less nutrient, less sedimentation coming in through the tributaries, runoff, that seemed to be part of the answer, at least in getting SAV to grow. SAV flourished during that time period. Salinities were a little bit higher, but not significantly. Salinity didn't have the salinity was only the indicator of less rainfall. But in my opinion, in order to stimulate SAV growth out here, there needs to be areas that we can create that are going to be wind protected, that are going to allow SAV species to grow and flourish. What we deal with now is we have grass pop up for small areas, but the problem is that grass isn't of significant size or acreage to create its own habitat. So what happens is that grass will grow for a number of years, and then we have a strong wind event, and it'll wipe it out. And then we're kind of back to where we started. So it's my opinion that if we truly want to be proactive in trying to restore the bay, we need to be doing things to limit wind fetch and to increase areas that are suitable for SAV. That could be pretty out of the box thinking when it gets down to driving tacks here. I'm talking about installation of possible weirs. I'm talking about structures that would reduce wind fetch, allow grass to grow. I've used a turbidity curtain project in the past where we set up turbidity curtains which are floating in a water column, and what we saw was pretty substantial. We saw lots of grass showing up in the leeward side of those curtains in areas that they were protected from hard winds, predominantly southwest winds. We saw grasses beginning to grow. So I think to really start looking at fixing the problem, which I think solely lies in SAV and underwater grasses, we need to think out of the box and look at some things we've never tried before, and really try to be proactive.
All right, that's awesome. So one last thing here, talking about restoration efforts. Just talk briefly about your bass restocking program that you had done for the last few years, and what's going on, what you're seeing as far as the results of that.
Okay. So many of you probably know we did a series of stockings of largemouth bass fingerlings, and just as a note, that was all done following 3 or 4 years of excellent SAV growth. 06, 07, 08, we saw excellent grass in Back Bay. As a result of that prompted me to really want to get proactive in trying to restore the bass fishery. 09, we did an experimental stocking to see if stocking was even going to be an option. We stocked about 70,000 bass, I believe, that were fingerling size. We monitored them over the following year or two. We saw excellent survival of those fish. That led to me being able to justify to my department, the Department of Game and Fish, a full-scale stocking effort. So in 2012, 2013, 2014, I might have those years off by a year or two. But for 3 consecutive years, we stocked largemouth bass fingerlings in Back Bay, about 125,000 fingerling bass per year. Those fish were marked with a chemical called oxytetracycline, which stains an inner bone inside their head. And what it does, it allows us to monitor and find those fish in following years. The fish is required to be sacrificed to get the bone, the otolith. But once we have it, we can determine whether or not it was a hatchery-raised fish or one that was naturally stocked, naturally spawned. What we've seen are excellent results. The hatchery bass have done great, but more importantly, natural reproduction has been through the roof. So, unbeknownst to me, the years that we were going to stock bass also happened to coincide with excellent largemouth natural reproduction. So not only did we stock fish, we had excellent natural reproduction at the same time, which meant for booming bass numbers. I think everybody would agree bass fishing is as good as it's been on Back Bay now than it's been in probably since the 80s. The numbers are certainly increasing. Size is increasing. You got to remember that takes time. That's not something that happens overnight. But we're seeing big improvements in the fishery, and hopefully that's a sign of things to come.